Okay, this is the second video on the wax passage from the second meditation. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the imagination and Descartes' argument that it can't be through the imagination that we know what the wax is. So I'm going to be looking in particular at this paragraph. So here, I'm going to go ahead and read it. So perhaps the answer lies in the thought which now comes to my mind, namely that the wax was not, after all, the sweetness of the honey, or the fragrance of the flowers, or the whiteness, or the shape, or the sound, but rather a body which presented itself to me in these various forms a little while ago, but which now exhibits different ones. Okay, so so here he's moving on from the proper sensibles. He's saying, well, what if it was the body that that presented me with these proper sensibles, right? So the proper sensibles and the proper objects of sense. The proper objects of sense, remember, were accidents for Aristotle. They were accidents for Aristotle. And so now he's wondering, well, what if it wasn't the whiteness or the sweetness, those accidents, but rather the body which presented it in those various forms a little while ago. But what exactly is it that I'm now imagining? So now he's going to be turned to the imagination. Let us concentrate. Take away everything which does not belong to the wax and see what is left. Merely something extended, flexible, and changeable. But what is meant here by flexible and changeable? Is it what I picture in my imagination? That this piece of wax is capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, or from a square shape to a triangular shape? No, not at all. For I can grasp that the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind, yet I'm unable to run through this immeasurable number of changes in my imagination, from which it follows that it is not the faculty of imagination that gives me my grasp of what the wax as flexible and changeable. And what is meant by extended? Extension, is the extension of the wax also unknown? For it increases the wax, for it increases if the wax melts, increases again if it boils, and is greater still if the heat is increased. I would not be making a correct judgment about the nature of wax unless I believed it capable of being extended in many more different ways than I ever encompass in my imagination. So that's the passage that I want to look at. And so far, remember, we've seen that it's not the proper sensibles. But remember, there were two other objects of sense, the common sensibles and the incidental. The common objects of sense and the incidental objects of sense. And here he says, well, okay, suppose it's not, we'll give up on the proper sensibles, the whiteness, the sweetness, the sound. And suppose, I mean, it seems like it's the body. That's what the wax is. It's not these mere outward modes. And can I know that body through the imagination? I mean, so the body is that thing that fills space, that's extended. It's also that thing that can change the way that it fills space. So it's flexible. And it can also change in other ways, and in general is changeable. And so that's what the body is, the wax is. And what we'll see is, even after we've cut away the contributions of the senses and the imagination, we will be left with an idea in the mind of something that's extended, flexible, and changeable. But for the time being, he's going to focus on that, the idea of its extension, flexibility, and changeability that we get through our imagination. And so he's going to be focusing on that aspect of our idea of a body that depends on the imagination. And he wants to know, is it through the idea I get in my imagination of the body that allows me to know what the wax is, what its nature is? And first he considers, well, I mean, part of what I get through the imagination is its shape, right? The round shape, the square shape, triangular shape. And I know it's capable of changing between all of these shapes. And he wonders, well, what are the shapes? I mean, if we think back to Aristotle here, what is shape? Take a minute. I mean, think about the objects of sense, the proper, common, and incidental objects of sense. What is shape for Aristotle? Well, it was also a common object of sense, right? And it was also an accident. So the shape of the wax is an accident or mode that the wax has. In the 2,000 years between Descartes and Aristotle, the common sensibles, it came to be thought, are perceived by the imagination. Why? Well, we can see that, before we answer why, we can see that Descartes endorses this if we flip to the next page. So my highlights are going to come with me, and I apologize about that. There's nothing I can do. But if we look at this passage here, at least by what they call the common sense, right? So this passage here, that is the power of the imagination. So you can see here that Descartes is identifying the common sense with the imagination. And the common sense is what's responsible for the common sensible species, right? The common sensory forms that we found in Aristotle, like shape. So let me erase that. Okay, flipping back to our other page. Looks like it's drifted down a little bit here. Let me move it up, maybe. Or maybe zoom. Oh boy. There we go. That's roughly right? Okay. The common sensibles, what are sensed by more than one sense, why would those be products of the imagination? Well, it was thought that the imagination, right, so the proper sensibles are perceived by one sense, the common sensible are perceived by more than one sense, and it was thought that the imagination is the faculty responsible for recognizing the commonalities from the two senses, right? So when I see the shape of the wax and when I touch the shape of the wax, I take in that shape through two different senses, but it's through the imagination that I recognize those shapes as common to the imagination. Products of what the imagination found to be common across the two senses. And so the common sensibles were associated with the imagination. Common sensibles like shape. Okay. So is what I know the wax to be, can I get that through the imagination? Is it what I picture in the imagination? You know, that it's capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, from a square shape to a triangular shape? Not at all, for I can grasp that the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind. Yet I'm unable to run through this immeasurable number of changes in my imagination. So I'm unable to run through, unable to run through this imaginable changes in my imagination. And we get a similar argument from which it follows that it's not the faculty of imagination that gives me my grasp of what's extended and changeable. And then he turns from shape to extension, or the filling of space. I mean, we don't have to worry too much about the difference between being extended and having a shape. And what is meant by extended? It is the extension of the wax that is also unknown, for it increases if the wax melts, increases again if it boils, and is greater still if the heat is increased. I would be making a correct judgment about the nature of the wax unless I believed it to be capable of being extended in many more different ways than I could ever encompass in my imagination. So there's through this immeasurable number of changes, yet I'm unable to run through the immeasurable number of changes in my imagination. I'm not able to encompass all of these different changes in the imagination. And so there's some thought here that, I mean, try to formulate the thought on your own. Pause the video. And what's Descartes' thought here? What's Descartes' thought here? Okay, I mean, the thought is the imagination is responsible for running through all of these various shapes, all of these various ways that the wax could be extended. And as a body, as something that fills space, the wax could be extended in many different ways, indefinitely many ways, right? Because the wax, because of the structure of space, right? Space is infinitely divisible and infinitely extends infinitely outwards, and the wax can take up any bit of space. And so because space is infinite, and because the wax can take on any form in space, the wax too could take on any one of these shapes. But if I spent the rest of my life imagining the different shapes that the wax could take up, I'm never going to run through an infinite number of shapes. And so Descartes thinks it can't be through the imagination that I know what the wax is. Why? Well, his thought is similar to the paragraph above, right? It's through the idea I have of the wax and what it is that I recognize the wax as the same again, right? And we saw that it wasn't through the proper sensibles, because all of those can change and I can still recognize the same wax again. And here he's arguing that even though I run through all of these different shapes in the imagination that the wax can take on, I can encounter the wax in shapes that I haven't imagined and yet recognize it as the same wax again, right? So because it's the essence of the wax, or what the wax is, that allows me to recognize the wax as the same again, and I can't run through all of those shapes in my imagination, it can't be through the idea of the wax from my imagination that I recognize the wax as the same again, or it can't be through the imagination that I know what the wax is. And so it can't be the imagination that gets me on to the essence, or lets me answer the question, what is it, for the wax, right? It can't be the imagination. And so it can't be through the common objects of sense, or the common sensible forms, those kind of accidents, that I know what the wax is.